In the early 1990s, deep within a sprawling industrial complex in Warsaw, a production line that had once churned out hundreds of thousands of glowing household screens fell permanently, irreversibly silent. The assembly operators who for decades had screwed together circuit boards, tested heavy picture tubes, and adjusted veneered wooden cabinets locked their toolboxes and walked out of the gates for the very last time. The factory was Warszawskie Zakłady Telewizyjne, the industrial cradle of the Neptun, the television brand that had defined the visual and domestic landscape of the Polish living room through generations of political and social transformation. For millions of households across the nation, daily life had revolved around its sturdy chassis, its comforting hum, and the heavy, satisfying mechanical click of its rotary channel selector, bringing the outside world into focus. Yet within a few short years following Poland's abrupt economic restructuring, the factory buildings were emptied, state distribution networks dissolved, retail catalogs wiped clean of domestic names, and foreign imports flooded living rooms that had once glowed with domestically assembled light. The television still lived vividly in collective memory, but the vast industrial apparatus that built it had entirely evaporated. The real story of Neptun is not simply the closing of a single manufacturing plant. It is the definitive investigation of how a nation's window to the world was dismantled by global market forces, leaving behind an entire industrial landscape. Welcome to European Television Brand Memories. Today we investigate the rise, dominance, and disappearance of the television that filled the communist living room. To understand how the Neptun television became a fixture of everyday life, we must return to post-war Poland, a nation undertaking the immense task of rebuilding its cities, its infrastructure, and its industrial identity from the severe devastation of the Second World War. In the mid-1950s, television broadcasting was little more than an experimental state-run venture operating out of Warsaw, limited to brief daily transmissions and reaching only a tiny fraction of urban households. Early receivers were scarce, prohibitively expensive imports, or fragile experimental units produced in very limited workshop batches. The state recognized early on that television was not merely a luxury entertainment appliance. It was a potent instrument of public information, cultural instruction, and state communication. To populate domestic living rooms with reliable receivers, the central authorities consolidated the country's nascent electronics manufacturing efforts, establishing specialized production facilities in industrial centers such as Warsaw and Wrocław. Out of this centralized industrial planning emerged Warszawskie Zakłady Telewizyjne, universally known as WZT. The factory was handed a monumental engineering challenge: design and manufacture a robust, standardized television receiver capable of withstanding fluctuating municipal electrical grids, utilizing available domestic and Eastern Bloc components, and achieving a production scale capable of satisfying a recovering society. Early models established the initial technical groundwork, but factory engineers understood that if television was to transition from a fragile novelty into a permanent part of domestic life, the receiver had to be engineered as a dependable piece of domestic furniture. The television had officially entered the National Economic Plan. The true industrial challenge, however, had only just begun. The definitive turning point for Polish television manufacturing arrived with the development and mass production of the Neptun series during the late 1960s and 1970s. The Neptun was engineered to solve a very specific set of domestic and industrial problems: how to construct a reliable, serviceable television using locally accessible semiconductors, resistors, and picture tubes while maintaining a physical aesthetic that felt modern and acceptable inside a modest apartment. The picture tube, the heavy glass component responsible for generating the image, dictated the depth of the cabinet, the physical weight handled by delivery workers, and the exact floor space families surrendered in cramped living quarters. Neptun engineers housed these heavy glass picture tubes inside sturdy wooden veneered cabinets that doubled as functional furniture surfaces, frequently supporting family photographs, decorative ceramics, or hand-crocheted lace cloths. Mechanically, the television relied on rotary channel selectors that emitted a heavy tactile click with every turn, switching between the limited channels broadcast by Telewizja Polska. Unlike delicate imported sets that proved notoriously difficult to service when local power grids surged, The Neptun was intentionally designed for longevity and repair. Its modular internal chassis allowed local technicians to access soldered components with standard hand tools. When a Polish family purchased a Neptun, it was never an impulse acquisition. It represented a major household investment that required months of disciplined saving and waiting on state distribution lists. The product successfully solved the crisis of domestic supply, but its deep reliance on a closed, state-planned supply chain established a hidden structural vulnerability. As production volume climbed across WZT assembly lines, sourcing high-grade electronic components began testing the absolute limits of domestic industrial capacity. By the 1970s and deep into the 1980s, the Neptun brand reached the absolute zenith of its cultural and industrial presence. In homes across Poland, ranging from newly constructed high-rise concrete housing estates in Ursynow to traditional rural farmhouses, the evening broadcast schedule created a synchronized national ritual. Families gathered closely around the glowing screen to watch the evening news bulletins, historical dramas, serialized entertainment, and major international sporting events. The television was now the undisputed physical and social center of the domestic interior. Supporting this living room presence stood a massive state-managed industrial apparatus. WZT factories operated continuous multi-shift schedules, turning out hundreds of thousands of receivers annually, backed by a sprawling network of state-run retail stores and authorized repair workshops. If a Neptun failed, the owner did not discard it. They contacted a local repair technician who arrived equipped with a heavy metal toolbox filled with replacement valves, fuses, and soldering irons. This ingrained repair culture was vital because replacement receivers were neither inexpensive nor readily accessible on demand. The brand represented domestic stability, shared national experience, and national industrial pride. What would be lost if this integrated system of local manufacturing, repair knowledge, and shared broadcasting disappeared entirely? The answer extended far beyond a fading brand name. It represented the total loss of a nation's sovereign capacity to design, build, maintain, and understand the core technology operating inside its own living rooms. The factory floor hummed with continuous mechanical activity, completely unaware of the structural tectonic shifts brewing just beyond the horizon. The decline of the Neptun television did not begin with a dramatic explosion, a sudden scandal, or an abrupt corporate bankruptcy announcement. It began with a small, persistent crack. The mounting difficulty of sourcing quality electronic components as state-planned supply chains bogged down amid the worsening economic stagnation of the late 1980s. Severe foreign currency constraints made it nearly impossible to import advanced integrated circuits and superior color picture tubes from Western suppliers, forcing engineers to rely on older, less efficient domestic or regional alternatives. Simultaneously, the global consumer electronics market was undergoing a rapid technological transformation. While Western and Asian manufacturers transitioned smoothly toward advanced color displays, automated surface mount assembly lines, and lightweight plastic chassis, Polish factories struggled with aging industrial machinery and rigid administrative production quotas. When the political and economic system underwent a radical transformation in 1989, state trade barriers fell away overnight. Imported television receivers from European and Asian electronics giants flooded the Polish market, offering brighter screens, infrared remote controls, sleeker modern designs, and aggressive price points made possible by massive global production scale. Retailers who had once proudly displayed rows of domestic Neptun receivers now filled their shop windows exclusively with foreign brands. WZT faced a crushing scale disadvantage and acute capital starvation. The factory attempted to modernize its offerings, but the modular chassis architecture designed for socialist plan manufacturing could not compete with mass-produced global platforms. Local repair workshops began closing as modular solid-state electronics made component-level repair obsolete, replaced entirely by disposable consumer goods. Shifts were abruptly cut, production slowed to a crawl. The historic assembly lines in Warsaw were forced to halt permanently. The familiar badge remained in nostalgic memory, but the factory no longer built screens. The economic shock therapy of the early 1990s swept away state subsidies, leaving historic manufacturing enterprises utterly exposed to international competitors operating with superior logistics, automated manufacturing, and vast capital reserves. Today, the Neptun television survives as an iconic artifact of 20th century industrial history and domestic culture. The state-owned enterprise that built it is gone, the Warsaw factory site has been thoroughly redeveloped, and the brand name exists primarily in archives, private collections, and retro tech enthusiast forums. Yet surviving Neptun sets continue to command serious attention among vintage electronics collectors and retro gaming hobbyists who wire vintage home computers and consoles directly into their heavy glass tube inputs. This is not mere passive nostalgia. It is active material appreciation for an era when televisions were constructed as durable, repairable household investments rather than disposable consumer electronics. Technicians and enthusiasts continue to trade rare wiring diagrams and spare components online, preserving a technical knowledge that corporate restructuring tried to erase. When a collector today turns on a surviving Neptun, the screen takes a moment to warm up, casting a familiar blue-gray phosphor glow across the room, and the heavy mechanical dial clicks satisfyingly into place. The socialist living room has vanished, the state enterprise is closed, but the heavy wooden cabinet and the glowing glass remain. See you in the next video.